Okay. So, welcome back after the break. Thanks for your essays. I wanted, before I begin and before I forget, to mention two books that I think are very interesting. One I got both of them over the break, and I've read one of them. One of them is called The Tao of Right and Wrong. So if you are reading The Abolition of Man, this is you'll note the allusion to Lewis's book here, The Tao. And it's a 3-chapter book written by a Canadian academic out in BC, recently published, and I can tell you that it's actually quite good. Very impressed. I wrote him thanking him for it, and he said spread the word. That just came out in 2018. So very interesting. So
Who's the author, sir?
Dennis Danielson. And he was a scholar, a Milton scholar, among other things. And I encountered his work back as an undergraduate and thought it was good at the time.
How do you spell his last name?
Danielson, just like Daniel, and S-O-N. And the second, I mentioned my Lewis's critique, which is also my critique of the human sciences that's implicit in the whole work, and it's particularly topical in That Hideous Strength, where he's talking about a sociologist, Mark Studdick. And there's a problem with his character, but the character is a product of his discipline and the approach the discipline takes in an attempt to what it really tries to do. So there's a broader based critique of the education system in Lewis that we'll talk about more when we come to the Abolition of Man. But I mentioned that psychology is one of those disciplines, and I mentioned that a book I'd read on this front, and Theodore Dalrymple. It's called Admirable Evasions: How Psychology Undermines Morality. Undermines the Tao, in other words. So the thesis is similar. He's a very interesting fellow, Dalrymple. It's not his real name, by the way. He's a British doctor and notes and has worked with the working class people of Britain for a long time, and he's a terrific essayist. I don't know if you know him from other things, but this is really good. And he's talking about, when he says how psychology, he's talking about all the variations, different schools of psychology. He does it as somebody who really knows what he's talking about. That's really interesting. And I just bring that to your attention. It's not really for the course per se, unless you're interested in going down that route. It's a little off topic, but I had mentioned it and just wanted to follow up with that. So we left off last time by me picking up on various themes in That Hideous Strength that I was going to follow up on. And one of them was the theme of love. And with love, I also said that in particular it would relate to conversion. And conversion experiences are important to the two main characters in the novel, the married couple, Mark and Jane Studdick. And both of them come to conversion. They do it in different ways. And I think we left off last time with talking about Jane coming into the doctor's office and reading about love. And she's a Renaissance literary scholar, and so she's been reading many of the same works that Lewis himself has been reading and writing on, for that matter. So I first encountered Lewis when I wrote a medieval literature essay on the Romance of the Rose. Study of allegory, the use of allegory in medieval literature, it's called The Allegory of Love, sorry. The Romance of the Rose is one of the works that he focuses on. It's what I wrote on. But The Allegory of Love is what it's called. Very interesting work, and he's reflecting on that here. He also writes The Four Loves, which perhaps you have read, and he expands on that and sort of disambiguates different meanings or types of love. But that's something different here. Here's the theme of love. And so one of the challenges or the points of interest in the novel is the fractured relationship that Jane has with her husband, Mark. It's fractured on both sides. And one of the main problems is their understanding of love, which has been skewed by a wide variety of things. It doesn't have a single source. Part of it is the understanding of the relation of the two sexes. That's one of the touch points. So what male and female means and how they're distinct, and are approached from different ways. But then they have the problem of the egalitarian model, which both of them accept. So they're very progressive, both of them in their views. Another is disciplinary. So, and both of them are dedicated to their work above all. As I said last time, Jane and Mark are pursuing their career, and they appear to have agreed that they would do this, and they're very happy to do that. They're both devoted to further studies. It sort of hits home for me because it's people at their advanced doctoral level, that sort of thing. And they've had to put off family and so forth for the purpose of doing that. But Jane finds herself resenting her husband, even though he's probably doing what they had agreed he would do and what she would do. She finds herself resenting him because he doesn't seem to love her. And that would bring her into a sense of conflict because she wants something that is unequal from him. Because love is not a relationship of equality. Or at least Lewis talks about that a great deal in the novel, about the nature of love and how we are invariably drawn to love something or worship something. And he, again, plays that out in various ways. So it's not something that we can avoid. It's going to come out in some way. So in that sense, That Hideous Strength is playing on the great themes of love that animate works as far back as Dante, and certainly the medieval allegory of love and so forth. So those, but he's theologized them just as Dante has. Whereas in his contemporaries' minds, marital relationships are there to serve a utilitarian purpose. And I think maybe that's one of the aspects of this work, which I think is interesting. The focus on technology or technique with respect to love, even, it serves an instrumental purpose. Maybe the instrumental purposes of sexual pleasure or of companionship. But there's no sense of a causation in the Aristotelian sense of the initial cause. Why does love exist at all? What's the purpose of love? Does it have an ultimate telos? In Christian understanding, the purpose of God made us, God who is love, made people in his own image, and he made us for love. He made us to worship him. Right? I think the Westminster Catechism, Shorter Catechism, said the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. But that word enjoy. And in marital services, this is really interesting. If you don't really hear the language that often in evangelical services, but in old Anglican services, so there's this odd language, with my body I thee worship. Both of them say. And it sounds sort of idolatrous, quite frankly. So with my body I thee worship, and they both marital partners are saying this. So there's an aspect of embodiedness, but also the worship through the body, and how that's going to take place in the confines of marriage, which I think is almost, it brings people to blush these days, or it sounds vaguely wrong. Like, worship? Like, oh, I'm going to honor you, but I'm going to worship you with my body? That sounds, I don't know about you, but even to me that sounds a little bit maybe inappropriate, maybe idolatrous, because worship is for God alone. Right? And the danger of idolatry. But God has instituted marriage, and Jesus endorses marriage, and the purpose of marriage is to fulfill the commandment given in Genesis 1:28. Be fruitful and multiply. First commandment. And the first couple, Adam and Eve, are the first model of marriage. And Jesus endorses this in Matthew 19:7. Right? It's not only confirmed, it's reinforced by Jesus, the importance of marriage. And we can get into the importance of, as a sidetrack, talk about the single life and so forth, but that will take us off topic here, and I don't really want to get into that. But so there's an important theological motif to love in That Hideous Strength, which Lewis is picking up on and connecting with all of the ways in which the modern workplace and the modern understanding of knowledge and the modern understanding of personhood has been broken away from the idea of teleology. So again, in Aristotelian notions of causation, we've got 4 causes. Anyone name the 4 causes for me? Anyone done enough Aristotle? It's really useful. Yes?
The last is the final cause.
Okay.
There's a formal cause.
Okay, formal's in there. And the material is also in there. And these are the ones, as I say, that people focus on. So technique, how we do things, there's a way of doing it. Formal, material, formal, or sometimes instrumental. So we could have a final, yeah. And so it gets different terminology depending on who you're talking about. But the initial cause. It's strange to think of it in terms of causes even. But what was the purpose of this thing being made in the mind of the designer? That's an important consideration. Like, what is this thing for? Why was it made? You need to consider that. And then what is the ultimate outcome of that will be the final cause. When I do literary theory, by the way, I talk about literary theory in relation to Aristotle's 4 notions of causality and say that initially literary theory would have embraced all 4 notions of causation, but as it goes by, it becomes more and more focused only on these ones, to the exclusion of any end game or telos. So why do we study? To get a job? No, that might be a good outcome, but that's not why we study. We don't study in order to get a job. Or if you think you're going to study to get a job and you don't get a job, you're going to think that your studies are useless, which is not true. Although if you don't get a job, it's going to be challenging. And I'm not saying it's not a significant reason, but getting a job is not the reason why you study. You study because you want to glorify God. That would be one reason. Well, then it would have to be a certain type of knowledge which would be glorifying to God. Well, what knowledge is that going to be? And it digs down into all of those issues. But I'll get into that more when we talk about the Abolition of Man, where it's more dealing with education and education theory. So let me not get distracted on that. But the theme of love, the relationship, the fractured relationship between Jane and Mark Studdock. So let me pick up a reading of that. And I think I did it last time, where she's reading in the director's office. And her eyes lit on the following words: "The beauty of the female is the root of joy to the female as well as to the male. And it is no accident that the goddess of love is older and stronger than the god. To desire the desiring of her own beauty is the vanity of Lilith. But to desire the enjoying of her own beauty is the obedience of Eve. And to both it is in the lover that the beloved tastes her own delightfulness. As obedience is the stairway of pleasure, so humility is the ... And then the door opens. These are strange lines, but they deal with how it's talking about how love can be misused, and it's Augustinian, by the way, this idea. So Augustine, if you haven't read him, and if you haven't, you must, explain sin as loving something in place of God. Everything is made to be loved. God is love, and He created everything by love, and we are to understand them in a loving relationship. But they can never lose sight of the fact that we're not to love those things instead of Him. That's the problem in the Garden of Eden to some degree. They loved the thing rather than God, and therefore they disobeyed Him. So it's a misplaced love. And in Dante, his whole Divine Comedy is structured in accordance to misplaced love. So in the Inferno, they're punished. You love this, then you get this outcome. You love that, then that, etc. And you suffer in accordance with your misplaced love. But so love is not just a marginal theme to That Hideous Strength. It's a crucial one. It might seem a little off topic, as we've been talking up to this point in the sci-fi trilogies about interplanetary travel and about angels and about a battle between Mal-Eldil and the dark demonic powers that seem to be opposing him. So that sort of spiritual warfare thing and the relationship of two people on planet Earth seems a little off topic and a little bit insignificant, I think. So, and that's part of the problem with this novel. I don't know what you think about the novel. Some people think it's the best thing they ever read, and I've heard some people think it's unreadable. That's a pretty broad range of opinions. Tolkien didn't like it at all. And the one thing that has to be admitted, and there's no denying it, is it's very different than the first two. Like, totally different. And when I first picked it up and read it, I thought, what the heck is he doing? I mean, what's wrong with you? Because you're expecting it to be like the first two, and it's not only is it on the Earth, as opposed to being science fiction, it's now reading like the sort of novel that both men loathe. It seems to me. Certainly not. I thought, if you told me that C.S. Lewis had written this, or I didn't know that it was, I'd wonder whether he had, quite frankly. And it's just a mixed bag as well. He's including this and that, and suddenly Merlin appears, and Jane Studdock is a relation of Henry VIII and stuff, and it like goes back, and then it turns out, Ransom is a descendant of who? King Arthur. And I think, oh, okay, now this is getting totally nuts. And then he throws Numenor in there. Numenor, which is in Tolkien's work, and Tolkien's work hasn't even been published yet, so this is ridiculous. It's like throwing Santa Claus in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's just, this is totally out of place. You've made Arthurian romance, and you've somehow sort of shoehorned that into this. Like well, come on. And so I don't think there's a lot you can say about it. It doesn't really work. To my mind, it doesn't really work, but it's still fascinating. But it's more fascinating than, I think, an effective novel. I don't think it's a terrifically effective novel, although I really like it. But that's because I really like what he's talking about, and I think it's endlessly fascinating. But as a standalone novel, you read it and think, no, you need to go back and edit this a bit. Yes?
Do you think he brought in Arthur just because he wanted to use Merlin so much? Because I feel like Merlin is such an important part of...
Yeah, well, okay, so I wasn't going to get to this, or I was going to get it when I was going to talk about Britain versus Logres, because he juxtaposes those two. Why does he want Merlin in there? Because this is, like, Merlin is about as mysterious in this as Tom Bombadil is in Tolkien's work. Critics don't know what to do with these guys. Why does, you're right, I think. I'm not sure if that's the only reason, but he does seem, Merlin has a big role in here. What's he doing with Merlin?
Power over nature.
Yes.
Or man's power over nature. The magical one.
Yeah, but he doesn't see it as a bad thing.
Yeah.
So it's not quite so simple, because he's saying power over nature is a problem. In Lewis's work, this is a serious problem. In The Abolition of Man, he talks about it in terms of the exploitation of certain people. So when we talk about the power of nature, we're not talking about all of humanity's power over nature. We're talking about a couple of individuals, scientists, bureaucrats who have power over nature, and when they say power over nature, they mean power over human nature. So it's a subjugation. There's an oppression in it. Is that what's going on with Merlin? No, it's not. And he talks about his magic as not being, it's not, and when he comes forward, it's not even clear whose side Merlin's on. That's one of the things they're trying to figure out. And for an evangelical or a Christian across the board, actually, whenever you encounter magic, you're like, witchcraft's forbidden in Scripture. So any mention of magic has got I'm worried about what's going on here. What exactly is being said here? Is magic being endorsed by Lewis? What exactly is being said? I mean, I think we could spend the whole class on that topic because it's such a complex thing in itself, and I don't have a whole class to spend on it, so I'll do my best here on it. I'm taking them out of order now, but you asked, and I want to follow up on that. I think he's talking about the very same thing that Lewis and Tolkien believe is good and healthy about classical myth and classical literature in general, and that is they adhere to the Tao, the moral law. It's an old understanding of the world, using the means of the world, and it's sort of neutral, he suggests. And Merlin is neutral. He's not on anyone's side. And that's why there's a rush to get him as well. We need to find Merlin, because if we can bring him in, then he can be used by either side. There's this weird scene in which he reveals himself as the Pendragon. And he knows the password or the secret words that were only known by a few individuals, and there will only be one who will know it, Merlin and whoever is the Pendragon, and of course Ransom happens to know the word, so he reveals that he is in fact the man that he needs to serve. And then Merlin bows at his knee, takes the knee and bows before him. So that theme is huge in this, and I don't even know where to go with that, because it's just so significant. But it seems to be a Adamic knowledge unspoiled by sin. That's what it is, a sort of Adamic knowledge. Now, I talked about the understanding in the Renaissance, and even before the Renaissance, but it's really strong in the Renaissance, of trying to get back to the language and knowledge that Adam had. So education, the purpose of education is to restore the ruins of our first parents, says Milton, by knowing God aright, etc. That's the purpose of education. Merlin has that sort of Adamic knowledge. So it's not that it's illicit, it's that it is a deeper and more profound knowledge than we now possess because of sin. So sin has brought a forgetfulness of that knowledge. And Merlin has not forgotten. He knows the words that Adam would have used, and thereby has power over things. And the world which was made by God responds to that sort of Adamic knowledge. And I think furthermore, both Tom Bombadil then and Merlin expressed Lewis and Tolkien's understanding of the right purpose of the humanities. Is to recover the true meaning of words, and thereby relate to the world rightly and to God rightly. That's the Christianizing of it. Merlin has no sense. It's clear that Merlin is a pagan. He's not a Christian. But Ransom can use him and baptize that Adamic knowledge with the knowledge that he possesses of Christ. Does that make any sense at all? Yeah. Yes, but it's like still really odd. Yeah. But if you want to dig down on this further, if you read Lewis's introduction to Renaissance literature, excluding drama, 16th century literature rather, it's in the Cambridge edition. It's a big fat book. He talks specifically about magic, and he wants to disabuse the readers of their belief that the Middle Ages were marked by superstitious adherence to magic. He says it's not so. The desire for magic and the practice of magic begins is concurrent with the rise of modern science. He says it's not in the medieval period, in fact. It arises right alongside the belief in the scientific method. That's when you start to see it. Not in the Middle Ages. You can read that yourself. So it's right at the beginning of that introduction to 16th century literature, which is a masterful work, by the way. Acknowledged as such by the Academy to this day, I think. It's regarded as one of his best critical works. So his Intro to 16th Century Literature. And that's important here. So this sort of magic is not really magic. That sort of magic that arises in the 16th and 17th century really is akin to witchcraft. But they don't do that in the Middle Ages, says Lewis. It's sort of an Adamic knowledge over nature. And then it's insufficient in and of itself. It needs theological knowledge on top of it to render it, to find its true purpose, its final telos. But it's real knowledge. And the humanities, as Lewis and Tolkien see it, is an attempt to recover that, and that's why they study languages, and why all of Tolkien's corpus is so much interested not only in using language but in inventing language. But he doesn't even think of it as we think of it as inventing languages. He thinks of it as discovering languages that are already there, if you can believe it. So these are pre-existent languages and there's a root to that, and so it's a study of etymology. Etym being the root, the roots of words, and the idea that the roots all lead back to Adam's original language. So therefore you study the various languages that have been developed after Babel, and underlying them, the connecting points will be that original language. And when he invents languages, he sees it not as inventing, but rather discovering the roots of all languages, and thereby having real knowledge through those words. So that's what's going on with Merlin. And with that, then, there is a view of Britain. There's the Britain of shopkeepers. So I'll read the passage. It's 369 of this book, and I'll try and give you this is the banquet at Belbury. Nope, Venus of St. Anne's. Is it? Yes, it is. Venus at St. Anne's. Venus being the goddess of love. But this is a discussion between Camilla and Denison. I'm going to read this at length, because it connects with just what I said. I'll begin at 367. So this is going to be a long reading, but I think it will connect some of the themes I've just talked about. Why Logres, sir, said Camilla. This is at St. Anne's, which is the place where the fellowship, the little church of people are opposing the dark forces of the NICE. Right? It's this ragtag group of individuals that meet at St. Anne's. But now Venus is coming to St. Anne's. Which Venus? Of course, Venus is the goddess of love. Perilander is about Venus. Well, this is the real Venus, however. But anyway, but why Logres, sir? Says Camilla. Dinner was over at St. Anne's, and they sat at their wine in a circle about the dining room fire. As Mrs. Dimble had prophesied, the men had cooked it very well. Only after their serving was over and the board cleared had they put on their festal garments. Now all sat at their ease and all diversely splendid. Ransom, crowned, at the right of the hearth, Grace Ironwood in black and silver opposite him. It was so warm that they had let the fire burn low, and in the candlelight the court dresses seemed to glow of themselves. "Tell them, Dimble," said Ransom, "I will not talk much from now on." "Are you tired, sir?" said Grace. "Is the pain bad?" "No, Grace," he replied, "it isn't that. But now that it's so very nearly time for me to go, all this begins to feel like a dream. A happy dream, you understand, all of it. Even the pain. I want to taste every drop. I feel as though it would be dissolved if I talked too much." "I suppose you got to go, sir?" said Ivy. "My dear," said he, "what else is there to do? I have not grown a day or an hour older since I came back from Paralandra." It's like the effect of the ring. "There is no natural death to look forward to." Note how death is seen here. Eternal life is not the ultimate good. Life for the sake of living is not the ultimate good. "The wound will only be healed in the world where it was got." "All this has the disadvantage of being clean contrary to the observed laws of nature," observed McPhee. McPhee is the literary representation of Lewis's old tutor, Fitzpatrick, whom he called the Great Knock. He's a logician, and he is not a believer at all. But his understanding of logic and his absolute severity with Lewis credits his own intellectual development with that severity, and McPhee represents that. So, sorry. "The director smiled without speaking, as a man who refuses to be drawn." Obviously, they've had many arguments on this. "It is not contrary to the laws of nature," said a voice from the corner where Grace Ironwood sat, almost invisible in the shadows. "You are quite right. The laws of the universe are never broken. Your mistake is to think that the little irregularities we have observed on one planet for a few hundred years are the real unbreakable laws, whereas they are only the remote results which the true laws bring about more often than not as a kind of accident." And then they get into a literary discussion. "Shakespeare never breaks the real laws of poetry," put in Dimble, "but by following them he breaks every now and then the little regularities which critics mistake for the real laws. Then the little critics call it a license. But there's nothing licentious about it to Shakespeare. And that," says Denison, "is why nothing in nature is quite regular. There are always exceptions. A good average uniformity, but not complete." "Not many exceptions to the law of death have come my way," observed McPhee. "And how," said Grace with much emphasis, "how should you expect to be there on more than one such occasion? Were you a friend of Arthur's or Barbarossa's? Did you know Enoch or Elijah?" Right, who were brought up by God to heaven without dying. "Do you mean," said Jane, "that the director, the Pendragon, is going where they went?" "He will be with Arthur, certainly," said Dimble. "I can't answer for the rest. There are people who have never died. We do not know yet why. We know a little more than we did about the how. There are many places in the universe, I mean this same physical universe in which our planet moves, where an organism can last practically forever. Where Arthur is, we know." "Where?" said Camilla. "In the third heaven, in Paralandra, in Aphalon, the distant island where the descendants of Tor and Tinidril will not find for 100 centuries. Perhaps alone, because again, Ransom saw him there, right?" He hesitated and looked at Ransom, who shook his head. "He's not alone." "And that is where Logres comes in, is it?" said Camilla. Now, Logres, remember, is the name for Camelot. It's a same thing. "That's where Logres comes in," said Camilla, "because he will be with Arthur." Dimble was silent for a few minutes, arranging and rearranging the fruit knife and fruit fork on his plate. And now is where it gets to it. It all began, he said, when we discovered that the Arthurian story is mostly true history, which is true. There was a moment in the 6th century when something like that, when something that is always trying to break through into this country nearly succeeded. Logres was our name for it. It will do as well as another. And then, gradually we began to see all English history in a new way. We discovered the haunting. What haunting? asked Camilla. How something we may call Britain is always haunted by something we may call Logres. Haven't you noticed that we are 2 countries? After every Arthur, a Mordred, a rebel, trying to break and destroy the kingdom. Behind every Milton, a Cromwell. Milton the Great One, Cromwell, the military man who ruins the vision, apparently. A nation of poets, a nation of shopkeepers. The home of Sidney and of Cecil Rhodes. Disparaging of Cecil Rhodes. Is it any wonder they call us hypocrites? But what they mistake for hypocrisy is really the struggle between Logres and Britain. So the true identity of the British people. Where does it lie? Is it with the poet and the myth and the mythological figure, the golden age, the true kingdom? So he's setting up what Augustine calls the 2 cities. So we've got the city of God on the one hand, and then we have the city of this world. The one is opposed to the city of God, and they exist simultaneously. It's not one and then the other. If you've read The City of God by Augustine, he talks about this explicitly. When Rome has been destroyed by the barbarians, he talks about how the city of God can never be destroyed. There's a city in the midst of the city, and it always exists in the same way the city of God is in the city of Toronto, while the city of Toronto seems to be opposed to the city of God, and yet it's still there. And so that battle between 2 countries is going, and that's what he is talking about then. There's a war of sorts between what in the book of Revelation will be talked about, Babylon the Great and the heavenly Jerusalem. Those 2 are vying for supremacy in this world. He paused and took a sip of wine before proceeding. It was long afterwards, he said, after the director had returned from the 3rd heaven, Paralandra, that we were told a little more. This haunting turned out to be not only from the other side of the invisible wall. Ransom was summoned to the bedside of an old man when dying in Cumberland. That's northwest England, the Lake District. His name would mean nothing to you if I told it. That man was the Pendragon, the successor of Arthur and Uther and Casabalan. Then we learn the truth. There has been a secret Logres in the very heart of Britain all these years, an unbroken succession of Pendragons. That old man was the 78th from Arthur. Our director received from him the office and the blessings. Tomorrow we shall know, or tonight, who is to be the 80th. Some of the Pendragons are well known to history, though not under that name. Others you've never heard of. But in every age, they and the little Logres which gathered round them have been the fingers which gave the tiny shove or the almost imperceptible pull to prod England out of the drunken sleep or to draw her back from the final outrage into which Britain tempted her. This new history of yours, said McPhee, is a wee bit lacking in documents. Always the skeptic. And fair enough. But so it's a theory of what I've said about the biblical account of that and what Augustine talks about and about Christian culture in the midst of a hostile pagan culture. And he's saying that even what was called the pagan culture of old is not hostile to it. So that's the moral law, the Tao. So it's not sin versus there's a sinful world, and then there's the sacred world. That's the misunderstanding. It's not either or in that sense. There are 2 cities that are at war with one another, but the world itself has been created by God, and He created it good, and it remains good. If it weren't good, it couldn't be redeemed. So when sin happens, the sin does not destroy the goodness of the world, nor does it destroy the goodness of human nature. It just perverts it. And this is a restoring of it. But the goodness of human nature can be understood and has been understood in the Tao, in the moral law, by every major religion throughout history. And Merlin's knowledge was of that sort, of that nature. It was in conjunction with the moral law, which he regards as an unbreakable thing. It can't. And Lewis has illustrated it in Paralandra and also in Out of the Silent Planet. There's a moral understanding of the way things are, which all rational beings hold, all of them, and they cannot break it. So that's what Merlin represents. It's an old type of knowledge. And so for that reason, Lewis says that we are, as Christians, we're actually closer to the ancient pagans than we are our contemporaries who reject the moral law. They are out of sorts with all people in all ages. There's a strong, strong emphasis on the importance of the moral law and how the modern technological age is in rebellion against it. And as I say, psychology is just one of the means by which that transpires. It's just one of them. But in general, there's the idea that we are a law unto ourselves. We can create laws and redefine even our own human nature, our bodies, our identities. We self-identify. Comments or questions? Threw a lot at you there. Yes.
You mentioned, so Ransom says he feels not 1 day or 1 hour older.
Yeah.
And when I was reading it, I immediately assumed older in the sense of Paralandra, but he feels like he hasn't gotten any
No.
wiser.
No.
I shouldn't think that way.
I don't take it that way. I think in terms of he hasn't physically aged, like in our normal sense, rather than in the sense of wiser and more knowledgeable, because he clearly has gained in knowledge. Yeah. And in wisdom, for that matter. It's more like a better analogy would be Bilbo. When he put on the ring, he felt like butter spread over too much bread, stretched thin. His life is continuing, but he's losing. Except the analogy doesn't fit because he feels vital. I don't think he feels weak. Whereas, because there's no sin involved with it, whereas in Bilbo's case, putting on the ring makes him desire the ring above all other. So there's a connection with the sinful lust after power in Bilbo, whereas here it seems the antithesis of that. He's just tasted something of immortality, and immortality is not the thing that he most desires. That's what the transhumanists want. They want human life to be continued eternally, with sin. So no death and sin reigns unchecked. That's what they want. And transhumanists to our very day are working on that very thing. I've put up a few links on our website. How Silicon Valley is trying to do that, and there are various forms of it. Whether it's taking your consciousness and somehow uploading it into a computer somewhere so you eternally exist in a virtual reality, that's you. It's a funny version of you, but it is certainly a popular view of human nature. We're just our mind, our thoughts. Or whether it's through using the cyborg type technology, you can replace your body with parts that aren't going to wear out. Keep swapping in parts. Better than the ones that you had before even. They might last longer, and when they start wearing out, well, you replace it with another one. Mm-hmm. And then you just keep on living. It's popular in our day. And we don't even think of it as that. So it's just wear and tear stuff like knee replacements and shoulder and hip and all that sort of stuff. Well, how about organs? You can grow organs. The organ replacements. Okay, so you're going to live longer. What's the purpose of living longer? You're going to live longer. Okay, that's good. Is it an unmitigated good to live longer? And I would say no, and Lewis certainly says no. It's not. And the great example of a worthy life is that of the martyr. Christ is actually the model. He laid down his life for others. That's a life worth living. as opposed to grasping life and holding on to your own life as if your own life were the greatest good of all. And that's what modern transhumanists do. They gain power over life and then they try and hold it as a possession. My precious. Right? I control it. I am the master of this life that I have. I identify what it is and it's mine. So they've put, both men are really looking at this. I talked about the eugenics movement, but even the transhumanist motif of taking power over human nature and distorting it from any sense of the purpose for which human nature was made and what its outcome is. Because the outcome of human nature is to be, first of all, to repent, because we can't go back to the beginning. We are born in sin. We need to repent, be restored. We need to be born again. And then when Christ comes, the second coming, he will renew all things. There'll be a new heaven and a new earth. But God will do that, not us. So there's a countercultural pressure there. Anyway, is that helpful at all? Okay. I say the more I talk, the more questions rise, I think. Because it goes that way, yes?
Well, I was thinking, what a great counterpoint in Out of the Silent Planet. The inhabitants were perfectly willing at the end of their assigned days to come before Oyarsa and have him unmake them.
Sure. Because unmaking them would not be the end of them.
Yeah.
Because they realized that the real place of life is with Mal-Eldil. And they are not going to get that in their mortal bodies. They can be transported like Elijah and Enoch. They can be taken up in that sense, but most are going to pass through the veil of mortality. They're going to die, and then they'll be there. But they're not going to grasp at their life and be willing to commit atrocious acts. One of the atrocious acts being holding on to their own life as if that were the greatest good. So it's a wrong way of looking at your life, as if it were yours. I'll put it in the words of another Protestant catechism, the Heidelberg Catechism. He said, the great consolation is that I am not my own, but belong body and soul to my Lord and Redeemer, Jesus Christ. But I am not my own. I don't belong to myself. Who says that these days? If God made you, and he died for you, and he's redeemed you, he's bought you at a price, of course you're not your own. You belong to him. He's your Lord. There's great comfort in that. It means he looks after you. But it also means that you are accountable. You have to be obedient. And again, I talked about the importance of obedience throughout the whole of the sci-fi trilogy. But at the end of that, then there is an end to your days on earth, and he knows that what that day will be, and it will happen when he determines it will happen. And it is sin to actually try and prolong your life through other means. Or at some point it's sin. When you don't consider the Tao, for instance. But it's not sin when it comes to eating food and sleeping and taking care of your body. That's not sin. That's treating your body with honor, the body that your God has created. That's a right use of it because he created the body for a purpose. Right? Romans 12 speaks of that. 1 and 2 talks about the body. Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, for this is your spiritual act of worship. Right? So there's a right understanding of the body, but if the purpose of the body is simply to extend the life of the body infinitely, then that's playing God with your own body. It's not just a small sin, it's a huge one. Or even worse, using other people's bodies for that reason, which Frankenstein did and which they do in That Hideous Strength. Yes, I do think that is a retort. And so we've had the example of Martians and Venetians, the inhabitants of planet Venus, Paralandra, as examples of how we could think about life differently on our silent planet. And now we can go back to the planet in which we inhabit and see how, not only how different it is here, but how at odds, at war, the world is with that idea. Because that's what's going on. There's a war going on. And it's under the guise of the NICE, which is the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments. Note that they experiment on people. And Studek has no problem with this, because that's what sociologists do anyway. They just have to sign a letter that says they agree to the experiment. And then that's the end of it. I don't think Lewis would agree. Because you don't, precisely because you don't actually, at the end of the day, that's not the only consideration. So let me put it to you differently. If I can waive my rights as an individual, how will I prevent the slavery that will ensue when I am powerless? So if I'm a young girl and I have a captor who is willing to promise certain things to me, I'll look after you, we'll do it. And you just have to agree to that you will give over your rights on this. We would say that the whole agreement is invalid, because a person cannot give up the possession of her body without her being violated at the most basic level, even if she agrees to it. It's exploitation. Even if I agree to it, it's exploitation. Because people were not made for prostitution or slavery. We weren't made for it. There's something fundamentally iniquitous about it, even if I agree to it. Well, a lot of people are brought into sex trafficking in agreement with it. They're tricked, but once they're in, then they can't get out. You could even sign a statement. So slavery is not just incidentally wrong, it's fundamentally wrong. And note that slaves characteristically like slavery. Even if they'd grown up, they'd rather be in that. So the captives of Israel, when they get brought out in the promised land, they want to go back because they were better fed there and they were looked after, and at least we knew what the conditions were. And now I got to wait for manna to fall every day, and my manna doesn't taste as good as the sacred raisin cakes and whatever else we were eating back there, and the garlic, and it's got good flavor, and this manna stuff. There, and it melts, and it tastes the same. And what is it? Manna means what is it in Hebrew, by the way. It's a pretty great joke. What is it? What is it? No, what is it? Yeah, it's what is it? It's like an Abbott and Costello thing. If you know who Abbott and Costello are. Look at the baseball joke, Abbott and Costello. Who's on first? What's on second? I don't know who's on third. Yeah. No, what's his name? No, what's on second? Why are you talking about second? I asked you who's on first. Right. Because the guy's name is who, and what's on second. Anyway, watch it. It's hilarious. But what is it is the same sort of thing. What is it? Manna. Which means, what is it? What is it? What is it? That's what I'm asking you. What is it? What is it? Are you... So... Gosh, that was a silly diversion.
No, it wasn't. But
yeah, I know it really was.
What frightened me was the blank stare.
Oh yeah, well, they're not.
That was a classic.
No, it's not.
routine.
No, well, it's not. No, that's not frightening. It's
No.
something to learn about. Let me also talk about the inner circle and the significance of this. Mark Studek, interestingly, craves, and this is how he is enticed. He wants to be part of the people in the know. He wants to be part of the inner ring. Now, Lewis describes that in his little essay, The Inner Ring. I think it's quite brilliant in explaining personal motivations for actions. And Studek really wants to be important. That's why he's studying. He believes he is a gifted man, and he wants to be useful and to do something important. And when he finds out that he can be put to use on this grand project of the NICE, he's very excited at this prospect. And they can use his knowledge, and all that they want from him is his ability to write. And he's like, writing is not my great gift. My great gift is my sociological knowledge. And they're like, we don't need that. We just need your ability to write. What am I going to write? Well, you're going to basically write fake news reports. And he's thinking, isn't there an ethical problem with that? And so there's a great deal of discussion back and forth about his understanding of ethics, and he's willing to breach them, by the way. He's willing to write up fake news for the sake of being in and getting more influence and power. But as they bring him in, note they do it by getting him to break the moral law. They're going to keep on getting him to break the moral law in more and more outrageous ways. And in the end, they want him to stamp on a crucifix, and then that's it. It's gone too far. Now it's very explicit what the purpose all along was. But all of the little breaches of his own moral code, which are actually part of the moral law, have been little small steps towards the big final one. This still happens, by the way. There was in Florida a number of years ago, a teacher was having people to stamp on a crucifix as part of desensitizing them to their moral convictions or religious convictions. We need to get rid of all that. We're going to do it by getting you to do something atrocious. Comment on that. The Germans, the Nazis, used to do this with the Jews. They used to get them to do dehumanizing activities. They get them to carry big piles of human excrement and clean it up and so forth. They would cut their hair so they lost their attractive appeal, take their clothes off, etc. But they'd make them do, it's called an excremental assault. You can do it in various ways. You can throw poo at somebody, or you can carry it. You do something that is like people go, ugh, I don't want to do that. Well, the people who do the revolting work, we tend to want to distance ourselves from them. Like, it's like, oh, you do what for a living? I shovel the you know what. Okay. Somebody's got to do it, but do you want to hang around with those people? Not really. Well, if you take a people group and continuously associate them with a distasteful or a disgusting act, you can start to think them as having a different human nature than you do. And that then removes your moral inhibition about doing something awful and subhuman to them, namely to gas them. So you start by getting the do disgusting and depraved acts, and then that's just the pretext for think of how this happens on the playground. You get the little weakling and you get him to do something funny, which is degrading to him, and then eventually that kid's going to get pounded. If you haven't seen it, then you have seen it. I've seen it with my own eyes. Yes?
There was a book I had a number of years ago called Jesus Freaks, which is a book of martyrs. And the one story inside was the Nazis burst into this home and were getting this Christian family to spit on the Bible.
Yep.
And the mother and father of this family immediately did it to preserve their own lives. But
yep.
Their young daughter, who was only 5 or 6,
wouldn't do it.
She wouldn't. She picked the Bible up out of the dirt and wiped the spit off of the dress and shot her. Yeah.
Wow.
That was relevant to your story.
Yeah, it's an interesting illustration. You could justify the parents' actions on one level. To say, I don't believe that the Bible is a holy thing because God alone is holy. This is it, and we're not Muslims. You can desecrate the Bible. Go ahead, burn the Bible, whatever. These are the words of God. We're going to revere, but I don't regard this as a holy thing, right? Say spit on the Bible, okay, whatever. They could probably. We're not there in that situation, but for the girl, she's saying, no, that represents this to me, and I will not do that. The girl was right. Were the parents right in what they did? Possibly, actually. But I don't know. If the girl felt so strongly about it, I suspect the parents were wrong. But maybe not. I don't know. But that's, you see what I mean? Like if you burn a Quran, or you even tear a page on it, there are riots. This is a sacred artifact, whatever. Christians in general don't have that view of Scripture. This is God's Word, but the Bible itself is not a sacred object per se. I mean, it's to be revered, it's to be understood as the truth, but God himself and his creatures are the only things that can't be treated that way. You can't kill and desecrate a person, but a book? I'm not sure Milton would agree with me. This is worse to kill a man, or better to kill a man than kill a good book. But that will get off the topic, and he's talking about that in Areopagitica, by the way. Anyway, I go on rabbit trails all the time. The inner circle. So extract. This is in the wet and windy night. Yes. So it's segment 5 of that, and about 8 pages in. And this is very interesting, and this is section 7. Mark finds himself left alone by Frost, and this is the turning point, the conversion moment for him, where he's going to be called upon to do an act which he feels violates everything sacred. He's already violated his conscience, and the little steps along the way have prepared him for the great violation, which is one of the reasons why we come down hard on plagiarism, because plagiarism doesn't matter at all, by the way. It's sort of, right? Because if you cheat on your essay, you're going to get a better mark, maybe. And if I don't know, who cares? Well, why do you care? Why are you willing to do something that's fraudulent for the sake of a better mark? If you're going to do that on something so insignificant, how about when things really matter? Like your fidelity to your wife or husband, or an oath that you're going to take. So if you're going to break it on a small, little, trivial matter of using somebody's intellectual property fraudulently and so forth, where are you going to stop? Because this really doesn't matter. But it's going to really matter, and you're just preparing the path down the road for yourself to commit that other thing, because you're doing a bad thing. So here it goes, and Mark at this point has gone way down that path. He's being used by the NIC. By the way, one of the things that outrages him, they don't even care about him. They want his wife, which also humiliates him, because he thinks he's so important, and really they're just trying to get his wife because they've recognized who she is, and they need her for the sake of getting Merlin, etc. But anyway, when Mark found himself left suddenly alone by Frost, his first sensation was an unexpected lightness of heart. It was not that he had any release from fears about the future. Rather, in the very midst of those fears, a strange sense of liberation had sprung up. The relief of no longer trying to win these men's confidence. Trying to get in, part of the inner ring. The shuffling off of miserable hopes was almost exhilarating. So he said, no, I'm not going to do it. And he feels the liberation from not getting the thing that he most desired, which was to be an insider. This straight fight after the long series of diplomatic failures was tonic. He might lose the straight fight, but at least it was now his side against theirs. And he could talk of his side now. Already he was with Jane and with all she symbolized. Indeed, it was he who was in the front line. Jane was almost a non-combatant. So he has decided he's not going to do what the NIC wants, and his life is now forfeit. And he's happy with that. He's decided it's not worth it. Now, this is the section I want to talk about here. The approval of one's conscience, the inner voice that it hears and understands the moral law. When you say that's not fair, he knows right and wrong, and he's been ignoring it. And now he's finally said, I'm going to do it, and even if the consequences are my life, I don't care, because it's more important to do something that's right, and die than it is to do what's wrong and benefit by being in the inner ring. That's just not worth it. Or as it was put by Jesus, it profiteth not a man to lose his soul, but gain the whole world. Right? Quoted in a famous movie by what's his name? Oh gosh, I just drawn a blank. It's about Thomas Becket. Man for All Seasons.
St. Thomas More?
Yeah, great movie, by the way. Man for All Seasons, watch it. Just brilliant.
Is that the one that Robert Shaw was in?
Yes. Robert Bolt is the playwright. The approval of one's own conscience is a very heady draft, and especially for those who are not accustomed to it. Within 2 minutes, Mark passed from the first involuntary sense of liberation to a conscious attitude of courage, and thence into unrestrained heroics. The picture of himself as hero and martyr, as Jack the Giant Killer, still coolly playing his hand even in the giant's kitchen, rose up before him, promising that it couldn't blot out forever those other and unendurable pictures of himself which had haunted him for the last few hours. It wasn't everyone, after all, who could have resisted an invitation like Frost's. An invitation that beckoned you right across the frontiers of human life into something that people had been trying to find since the beginning of the world, the secret of immortality. A touch on that infinitely secret chord which was the real nerve of all history. How it would have attracted him once. Would have attracted him once. Suddenly, like a thing that leapt to him across infinite distances with the speed of light, desire, salt, black, ravenous, unanswerable desire, took him by the throat. The merest hint will convey to those who have felt it the quality of the emotion which now shook him, like a dog shaking a rat. For others, no description perhaps will avail. Many writers speak of it in terms of lust, a description admirably illuminating from within, totally misleading from without. It has nothing to do with the body. So it's the desire for something that is illicit. It's got nothing to do with a physical desire. So within us, there's this warring desire for sin and a desire for obedience, and the two are at war. The Apostle Paul talks about it in Romans 6. C.S.Lewis talked about it in Paralandra at length. Ransom himself had to go through this. In the end, he had to obey. He was only able to obey because Mal-Eldel had called him already, so he was one of Mal-Eldel's servant. He can't do it on his own. But this man has now experienced the conversion, and he is able to do what he couldn't do before. Remember, St. Anne's has been praying for him, and now he is able to do what he was incapable of doing before. So that's his conversion, and he's obeying that inner voice of conscience, which he had to that point suppressed and had been progressively killing, murdering his conscience, or searing it, as Scripture speaks of it. I think that's fascinating. So that's the theme of love here. Note that he's willing to give of his life for his wife now. He's now in front of her. She's behind him. He's doing it for her sake. He's willing to sacrifice all of his ambitions and his life for her. And note he's not even thinking about her now, because actually he's doing it not for her even, first and foremost. He's doing it for God. And therefore for his wife. By the way, some of the church fathers spoke of Adam's sin, one aspect of Adam's sin as uxoriousness. There's a word you don't hear very often. Excessive love of your uxor, your spouse. Adam loved Eve more than he loved God. Nothing wrong with loving your wife. There is when it comes at the expense of obeying your Lord. Remains, you can see it in the New Testament as well. But no, even the language there. So Jane was almost a non-combatant. She's not even a part of it, because he's now taking the lead on this, and he's loving her in her absence as he ought to. He's fighting for her, and she doesn't even know it. But then, as soon as he does that, then he hears the other voice, which is pushing him and tempting him with an almost irresistible desire for the thing that he's just fought down. So, and Lewis talks about this repeatedly in his own work. You only really know how powerful sin is when you try and resist it. That's when you first learn. Up to that point, you're not aware of it all. Try obeying sometime. And then you'll find how hard it is. And in Scripture says it's impossible without God, in fact. So then what's the point of the temptation? To throw you upon God's grace and mercy and acquaint you with his love for you and how he is walking with you through all of these things. And you're not aware of that until you're aware of how little you're able to resist it. I talked about the relation of male and female and the essay on equality. One way into it is by reading his essay on membership, which is really helpful, I think. If you haven't read it, I recommend it, just like his The Inner Ring from the collection called The Weight of Glory, which is also glorious. All three of those are superb. But in membership, he talks about being part of a body. And in that relationship, equality is not something that we desire even. So in the right relation of equality, right relations of the body of Christ, equality is not a term that is to be used at all. It's like saying your hand is equal to your foot. They're just totally different parts. They both are necessary. They both are good, but they're not equal. Or you'd be walking on your hands and picking up things with your feet, or running on your hands, or your stomach and your head. I mean, you could, but the members of a body is a different analogy, and equality is something that really doesn't fit. And Lewis says in that little essay that we wrongly use the notion of equality in every human relationship, thinking that it will solve the problems. And he says it not only doesn't it solve all the problems, it creates different ones. But it does have some use. So what is equality? And here's this famous phrase: it's medicine, not food. That's the one that sticks with me at any rate. Equality is there to prevent people from exploiting us, for recognizing that every single person bears the image of God, and therefore we're equal under the law. Even a king is under the law. Even a king. A president, a king, a prime minister is like you and I, under the law, a human being, and equally can be judged by it. Cannot break the law. So in that sense, equality is essential. So it's essential to uphold the equality of women. It's essential. The full equality. To prevent exploitation. On the other hand, the purpose of relationships between men and women and subjects and kings is not to ensure equality, because that destroys the distinctiveness of them. That's what he's talking about. So equality is there to keep sin from making relationships toxic, but it's not there to allow them to flourish. To allow them to flourish, you have to allow their distinctiveness. And part of their distinctiveness is submission. And submission is not a relationship of equals. And without that understanding, you can't understand eros. Or agape love. Even more so. Agape love. This is love, not that we love God, but that God loved us and gave his son as an atoning sacrifice, right? It's unlikes. This is God who loves us. And how does he love us? He dies for us. That's an unrepeatable act of grace. We can't even understand it. So there's nothing equal. And in Philippians it says that Jesus, when he became a man, considered equality with God not something to be grasped, but became a servant in human likeness. So he condescended, he humbled himself, he took on a human body. We didn't become equal with God. He condescended to us. Jesus remained God. Right? So that all that equality distorts the beauty of the creator-creature distinction, which is essential to understanding God's love and also even understanding human love. So he'll talk about that at various points. So I talked earlier about 62, 63. I'll pick it up at 314 and onwards. Decidedly countercultural. And Lewis is much critiqued, even by my favorite literary critics today, for his views on women in the clergy and so forth. I think it's called Women in the Priesthood. There's an essay he wrote on that. Because he's not an egalitarian. I don't want to get into all that stuff. I just don't care about it, quite frankly. But 314. And it's section 5 of Real Life is Meeting is the broader title of the chapter. I don't know what the chapter is, but it's called Real Life is Meeting. And section 5. It sounds rather like a mythological picture by Titian come to life. Now, Titian is a painter, Italian Renaissance painter.